over to Claudia. We picked tonight's topic on Fusarium diseases in tomatoes. So I don't know if you guys remember last year, kind of all the news headlines and chaos surrounding the tomato troubles. A lot of growers had tomato problems, and I know our program and Claudia's lab especially received a lot of inquiries about tomato plants with various symptoms like yellow leaves, green leaves with purple veins, poor growth, or rolled leaves. So I think kind of the hype in the media, a lot of that was associated with the curly top virus. But really, a lot of what we found, it wasn't so much the virus, but it was more so kind of the prolonged cold temperatures that we had in May and June that caused a lot of gardeners and farmers having to wait to plant their tomatoes. So this led to a lot of root-bound plants and other poor root development. But then that sudden increase in temperature after that planting led to a growth spurt of above ground, while roots were unable to keep up. So some tomato plants developed adventitious roots, but the fine roots were unable to compensate for the poor development of the primary roots. And then tonight, I'll kind of allow Claudia to share her screen, but she's going to talk to us about some different diseases we have in our tomato plants, especially Fusarium, which is very common here in Utah. So Claudia, I'll let you share your screen and we'll
Let's see.
give it to you.
Can you all see it?
Yep, you're all set.
All right, so as Nick mentioned, last year we had a lot of samples. In my lab received about 50 to 60 samples, tomato samples, that all had pretty much the same symptoms. They looked poorly grown, stunted, root development was very poor. A lot of the roots were root bound. And I think if it had been a year where you had still, normal growth, all these Fusariums couldn't have caused as much damage as they did. But if you have a poor root system to begin with, and then the few roots that do develop get rotten by fungi, there's nothing left for the plant to take up nutrients and water. And that then affects, of course, the growth. So what we found last year in most of the tomato samples that we received were several different Fusarium species that cause different diseases on tomatoes. And that's what I will be talking about tonight. Out of all those samples that we received last year, only 3 had actual curly top. So that was a very low quantity for what we normally get every year. So Fusarium is a soil-borne fungus. There are several species that can infect tomatoes. There are species that go to other vegetables, but most of them are very host specific. So Fusarium oxysporum forma specialis leucopersicii, and you can see with the forma specialis leucopersicii, leucopersicum is this scientific genus name for tomato, that this Fusarium species is specific to tomato. So even though there is a Fusarium oxysporum that can go to cucurbits, to melons, this one will not go to melons. The one that goes to melons has a different forma specialis. So you could still plant melons in that spot if you had Fusarium oxysporum forma specialis leucopersicii. The second Fusarium oxysporum is forma specialis radicis leucopersicii, which indicates that it will also attack the roots of tomatoes. And again, this one is specific to tomatoes as well. And the third one that we found was Fusarium solani. Solani is a more widespread pathogen that it goes to several different hosts, especially in the Solanaceous family. And a forma specialis is just a term used to classify identical fungi that differ in their host range. Fusariums disperse by producing spores. Sometimes you can see them as like a white or pinkish mass on the base of the stem. And those spores, when you look at them under the microscope, they have this canoe shape to them, which is very characteristic of Fusarium species. They also produce resting spores called chlamydospores that survive in the soil. Those are those round spores, and they can survive for several years in the soil. So even if you rotate for 5 or 6 years out of tomatoes, the spores would still be alive. And then when you plant tomatoes again, they would just be able to colonize the tomato roots. So I will be talking briefly about all 3 diseases. Fusarium wilt is caused by Fusarium oxysporum forma specialis leucopersici. We see it in Utah occasionally, but it's not as common as the other Fusarium diseases. As I mentioned, it is specific to tomato. The symptoms look very similar to verticillium wilt. That's another soil-borne disease. The plants initially wilt during the hot part of the day, but when it cools down in the evening, they might initially recover. So it looks like just some drought stress. However, over time, as the disease continues to progress, the plant will be permanently wilting. When you cut the stem and you look at the vascular tissue, which is what you can see here, this here is all brown. That's the diseased tissue. If it was a healthy plant, it should be white. So this is an indication of a vascular infection, but verticillium wilt will do the same thing. So in order to differentiate between verticillium wilt and Fusarium wilt, you would need to send a sample to a diagnostic lab so the fungus could be cultured and then identified what the causal agent is. You also see the initial wilting. This was a lot of what we saw last year, wilting, yellowing of leaves, and dieback of leaves. To manage Fusarium wilt, using raised beds, if you have a problem persistently in your yard or on your small farm, and line them either with plastic mulch, so they're not getting in contact with the bare ground where you had the problem before, or if you can raise the beds above ground and use soil or a potting mix that has not been exposed to any of these Fusarium. So if you use compost, you want to make sure that you know exactly what was put on that compost, because the Fusarium spores will most likely survive composting, especially because the compost does not get hot enough in every spot to kill all the spores. There are resistant varieties available for Fusarium wilt, resistant tomato varieties. And when you look at the label, so it will either list Fusarium wilt, and the 1 and 2 behind it is an indication that there are several races of Fusarium wilt. There's, I think, 3 right now. And so this particular variety will be resistant to races 1 and 2. So my testing, when I culture the fungi, I can tell you it's Fusarium wilt. I cannot tell you which race it is. That is only something you can determine by planting tomato varieties of different resistance levels to see which ones are resistant to the race that you have in the ground. Or in some cases, the seller will abbreviate the disease resistance with codes. And if you have an F, that indicates that it's resistant to Fusarium wilt. You can go to this website from Cornell University. They list all the, or a lot of the tomato varieties with resistance levels to a variety of different diseases, including various Fusarium diseases, as well as viruses and nematodes. Now, if they are labeled as resistant with an F or FOL for Fusarium oxysporum leucopersicii. They are only resistant to Fusarium wilt. They are not resistant to any other Fusarium disease. I had several commercial growers last year say, well, I planted that variety, it's resistant to Fusarium. And then when we looked up the variety, it says it was resistant to Fusarium wilt, but not the actual Fusarium they had causing the problem. There are no effective fungicides for any of the Fusarium diseases. So there's no need to apply fungicides. It's just a waste of money. Fusarium crown and root rot is caused by Fusarium oxysporum forma specialis radicis leucopersicii. It's also specific to tomatoes. The symptoms you see, just like with Fusarium wilt, you will see wilting, you will see vascular discoloration, you see stunted growth, but in addition to all of that, you will see a root rot. You will not see a root rot with Fusarium wilt. So that is a big difference. If you pull up a plant and you see rotten roots, you can already rule out Fusarium wilt. And again, you see the same symptoms I showed you for Fusarium wilt, but in addition, you also get this root rot. So if you look at this root, you can see here that the cortex, the outer part of the root is missing, and all you have is the inner core. You can take your fingers and just gently pull along the roots, and you often can just pull that outer cortex of the root off. To manage Fusarium crown and root rot, again, use raised beds with either plastic mulch covering the ground or raising the beds up above ground. There are also no effective fungicides. There are some resistant varieties, tomato varieties available, and they will have either FORL listed, or it will be spelled out like I showed you before on that other, let me go back. Like here, this variety is also resistant to Fusarium crown and root rot. Now, lastly, we have Fusarium foot rot. Causal agent is Fusarium solani. Its host range includes tomatoes, potatoes, and peppers. You will see lesions on roots, and you will see girdled roots. You will see on the foliage interveinal chlorosis. You will not see vascular discoloration. So here you can see that the entire core of the roots rotten. So this is the outer vascular tissue that was rotten with the other two Fusarium diseases. With Fusarium solani, the interior part of the root is rotten all the way down to the roots. And then you get this interveinal chlorosis, which looks very similar to a nutrient deficiency, which it actually is, because with the rotten roots and the rotten decaying stem, there's no nutrients coming up into the plant that could be used by the plant for growth. Fusarium foot rot is more difficult to manage. There's no resistant varieties available. So the only thing you can do is use raised beds with either plastic mulch or raising them up above ground so the plants cannot come into contact with the ground. And since I mentioned that we need to, or you could submit samples if you wanted to find out exactly which Fusarium you have, or if it's Verticillium wilt and not Fusarium wilt, you can submit samples to our diagnostic lab. For pathogen culturing, we charge $15 for the species identification of the Fusarium. We would have to do DNA sequencing, which would then cost you $30. Oops, that was too fast. You can go to our website, submit a sample. We have different options for payment. You can pay with cash, check, or we can send you an invoice through PayPal so you can pay online. We have a submission sheet we would like you to fill in with as much detail as you can provide. How many plants are affected? What had you planted there last year? Did you have problems last year in that same spot? Maybe with another variety. So if you have tomatoes this year and the roots start to rot, and you had peppers last year in that spot and they start rotting, and we isolate a Fusarium, it could most likely be Fusarium solani. Let's see, what else do we need on that sheet? How much you irrigate, the variety of the tomatoes, if you have it. All this information can help us narrow down and more easily determine which Fusarium species you might have. And Nick, that was all that I had.
Awesome. Thank you, Claudia. So there's a few things I also want to share with you guys. So last year, Claudia and I, we put together this fact sheet on Fusarium and then the similar but different verticillium wilts that we have in vegetable. So this is a really good guide where we kind of go in depth on the science of it, the different species, symptoms and disease cycles, and we cover all the vegetables, including our tomato crops. And we cover a lot of the prevention and management of where it's been diagnosed as well. So this is a good resource for you to refer to. And Claudia was mentioning different resistant varieties. So we did put together a table where we list some that are resistant to the different races of Fusarium wilt. So you can see we have quite a few options for tomatoes. So if it's something you have a problem with, I think this would be your number one go-to, is just planting something that's resistant. Also, if you guys aren't familiar with, we have our Abiotic Disorders of Tomatoes guidebook. So this is something we put out, I think, a year or two ago. We cover all the different problems that can happen with your tomato plants that aren't a disease. So this can include different abiotic things such as the weather, and other nutrient deficiencies. So we talk about like adventitious growth, blossom drop, and all sorts of different things. So you can find this on our website. Just go to extension.usu.edu/pest, click books and guides, and then alphabetically, it will be our first one listed. So definitely check out this guidebook, Abiotic Disorders of Tomatoes. So with